I'll just wait for Ella to start recording. She has started recording. Okay. Following the talk, there will be plenty of opportunities for you to ask Rihab some questions. And if you could please submit those questions through the chat, and then I will either read them out and ask Rihab to respond, or I will ask you to unmute and read them out yourselves and have discussion with Rihab. So that's all the household rules and regulations. So it's now time to introduce our speaker. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce to you Dr. Rihab Khalid, who is one of our newest junior research fellows, appointed only in October 2020. Rihab is an interdisciplinary researcher in sustainable energy consumption and demand management. She's interested in the intersections of gender, energy infrastructure, and space use, in particular in Pakistan. And she works on understanding energy demand, where she uses socio-cultural theories with more technically grounding understandings of consumption in the context of architectural and urban spaces. So you can't really get much more interdisciplinary than Rihab. Rihab's committed to problem-driven research to tackle societal challenges and to improve energy efficiency and sufficiency to meet climate change targets. Now, if you think that Rihab looks as if it's a bit later where she is than it is with us, then you're totally right, because she will be presenting from Pakistan, where she is currently working and doing her research, but where she's also decided to stay because it was quite difficult to get back to the UK at the moment. Rihab, I'm very pleased to hand over the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Henriette, for that lovely introduction. So let me just share my screen with you all now. So my internet connection might not be the best, and I might have to just turn my video off. And if I could request you all to turn yours as well, just for the presentation. And hopefully I'll be able to manage and get through the presentation without any hiccups. Okay, so thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and thank you all for coming. So the title of my talk today is A Socio-Technical Approach to Domestic Energy Demand, the case study of middle-class housing in Pakistan. Now, this is based on my PhD research, specifically on these two papers that I've noted down here. So let me start with the background. Now, energy demand in the global south is predicted to grow to 3 times that of the developed world by 2040. And by 2030, it is estimated that about 80% of the middle class globally will be residing in the global south and will be responsible for 70% of worldwide energy consumption. Now, Pakistan is one such country in the global south that has been facing increasing gaps between its energy supply and demand. It's among the top 20 countries identified as being most vulnerable to climate change. Now, the common form of demand management in Pakistan has been electricity load setting, where the power remains shut down for up to 6 to 8 hours in the urban areas. And this serves as the last resort to overcome these energy gaps. Now, I'd like to share this image, which is a satellite view of the city of Lahore, taken in 2013. What's interesting about this is that you can see where the power blackouts were taking place. So all of these black patches are where there was a blackout at the time. Now, as you can imagine, this has had a profound effect on the GDP of the country, but also on the daily lives of the people. Now, before we begin to tackle this energy demand, I think it's important for us to understand what energy is for and how it has come about. So one way to look at it is to think of energy as an input to provide products or services. And this is the view that is commonly taken up by government policy. However, an alternative view is to think of energy demand as an outcome of what people and organizations do. And this is has been taken up by a number of social. It's a cultural framework that proposes that the basic unit of analysis should be the practices. So instead of focusing on individuals and their rational choices, or on the normative collective structures, the focus point of analysis to understand social order should be practices, that is, the doings and sayings of people. Now, in my methodological framework, I have tried to bring together these two parallel streams from different disciplines. So, the place for space in sociology, together with the concepts of social in architecture, particularly using these three theoretical frames. So I mostly draw on Chauve and Panzer's model of practice, which is formed of three basic elements: competences, meanings, and materiality. Architecture as a mediator, using the Friedegg model proposed by Muller and Reichman, which suggests that architecture can be seen as one form of materiality, which itself is a social construct, and as such can mediate social action. And finally, I combine this with Fatzi's framework of practice arrangements. So looking at both social and the material structures that together define electricity consumption by using both qualitative and quantitative modes of data collection in a mixed methods socio-technical approach. So for me, the starting point really was to understand, how did we get to this point, to this contemporary state of household practices and material arrangements that have resulted in such high levels of energy consumption. And to understand this, I want to take you through a timeline of how the house spaces and the accompanying social practices have evolved over the last century in Lahore, called the walled city. Now, until the 19th century, construction of housing had followed much the same pattern in a maze-like urban fabric. Traditional houses are called havelis, which represent the vernacular central courtyard design. Traditionally, Muslim housing was designed to be introverted, and these accommodated joint multi-generational families. And they were based on a strict demarcation of private and public spaces, expressed in distinct layers of social accessibility through the architecture. So the courtyard being the focal point of the house and the central space, so most private zone, and so most conducive to female practices. And so most of the female practices like cooking, cleaning, washing, bathing, and even sleeping at night was done here. This was then surrounded by a layer of semi-private rooms, which were used interchangeably throughout the seasons, such as for sitting, for the extension of the cooking practice, and storage. And then at the outer periphery would be a betik, a sitting room, or a second courtyard, which would then open onto the street and was used for hosting male gatherings as an extension of the public space. Now, during the colonial occupation in the late 19th century, housing for the ruling British class departed from tradition, introducing new meanings of ideal homes and appropriate hygiene, which resulted in a new housing typology called the British bungalow. The house design now reversed in on itself, with the built area in the center, surrounded by large outdoor spaces. Bungalows were also defined by their biaxial symmetry in a grid-iron planned urban layout. The introduction of verandas and central passageways for proper air circulation, as well as designated spaces like separate offices, dining rooms, and study areas. But most significant was the absence of a centrally enclosed courtyard space. Now, by the 1920s, the local affluent residents had started building their own housing communities in imitation of the colonial spaces. And this resulted in a hybridized bungalow, where the front reflected the colonial ideologies, while the back remained traditional in use. So you can see that the kitchen was now spun around and attached back to the main structure. The dining hall pushed back for closer proximity. But most importantly, the backyard had now replaced the central courtyard as the focal point of activity. Now, after independence in 1947, many new planned housing schemes were developed under the new local authorities. And during this time, building regulations gradually changed in two major ways. So first, the plot sizes reduced over time, but at the same time, the maximum permissible covered area ratios increased. And of course, this is understandable because of the population expansion and increasing land value. So what was the result of this? This resulted in the verandas and the central passageways, as well as the backyards, reducing in size over time. By the 70s, there was another major player that came about, and this was technological innovation. So there were two important technological changes that took place. The first was the introduction of televisions, which completely changed evening entertainment and relaxation activities. You can see now that there's the TV lounge, which takes the central space in the house. But most importantly, there was the advent of mechanical ventilation and cooling, which completely revolutionized the spatial configuration. So as you can see, the verandas and the central passageways have now completely disappeared. The backyard has shrunk significantly in size, and the built area now dominates the unbuilt. Now, Lahore has been expanding exponentially since the turn of the century, and from here onwards till the present, it has simply been a matter of progressively increased dependency on mechanical means, not just for comfort, but for almost all household practices. So we see that in contemporary houses today, they are formed of these condensed, deep, open-planned configurations, which are based on Western modernism and postmodernism, with maximized covered areas, minimal outdoor spaces, and the focus is certainly on aesthetics. And just look at the number of spaces that these areas are divided into now. Okay, so what does this analysis tell us? So there have been three key processes of change in household practices and material arrangements that have given rise to increasing household electricity consumption. The first has been a shift from more outdoor to indoor activities. So we saw how in the traditional Havelis, the central courtyards were replaced by the backyards, which gradually reduced and then completely disappeared under the changing building regulations and also technological advancements. So if you look at the electric appliance ownership statistics, of course, we find that over time, these have increased consistently, which means that more and more technological appliances are now being used for most household practices. But at the same time, there has been a blind following of these Western concepts of modern architecture that have resulted in the gradual disappearance of outdoor activities and the spaces that accommodated them. So houses today are only functional so long as they are dependent on mechanical means. So much so that about 47% of the total household electricity consumption goes into space cooling in some shape or form. So the second has been a shift from an inward to an outward oriented design. So traditionally, houses were designed to be introverted with layers of private and public spaces. But we saw that with colonial-inspired building regulations, they had a profound effect on the privacy of outdoor spaces. So the close proximity of these narrow outdoor spaces, together with restrictions on the heights of boundary walls, has meant that these are no longer conducive to the socio-cultural norms of privacy for female practices, which means that they are now taken indoors, which means that there's greater reliance on artificial means for lighting, cooling, etc. But at the same time, even indoor spaces have also transformed. So because they are now more open planned with large glass windows, often these also are not conducive to female practices. So a lot of the female homeowners that I talked to during my interviews had similar things to say. I want to have my privacy when I'm in my bedroom. I like that the curtains remain drawn always. I don't feel comfortable if neighbors and house staff can see inside. And so what happens is that these large windows are then closed off with layers and layers of curtains and blinds and bamboo sheets and green cloth to prevent heat gains, but also to ensure privacy of these indoor spaces. And finally, there has been a spatial dispersion of practices. So traditionally, spaces were designed to be multifunctional and polyvalent, promoting more collective practices. But we saw that in the bungalows, new distinct spaces like separate studies, offices, and dining rooms were being introduced. So there was much more functional specificity. And this was further promulgated by the replacement of very lightweight portable furniture with heavy stylized and ornamental furnishings. For example, in the 70s, wooden single beds became popular, which were then replaced by double beds in the 80s, and then heavy dining sets as well. So clearly, the increased material dependency has been at fault. But at the same time, there has been a change in the socio-cultural norms from more collective to more individualized practices. So a lot of the older residents that I talked to had similar things to say. Back then, it wasn't the norm to have a lot of rooms, have separate bedrooms for everyone. Everyone used to sleep and live together. This is quite a recent trend. Now, everyone demands a separate bedroom for so-called privacy. There was also this notion that if 30 years ago there was a single television set to accommodate the needs of the entire multi-generational household, over time what we see is that entertainment facilities have now been divided so that they cater to the needs of, if not the individual, then at least for each separate generation living within the same house. Okay, so now having done this analysis, the next step for me really was to understand, where do we go from here? What interventions and practices could lead to improved sustainability and reduced consumption? Now, it's always easier to identify problems than it is to propose solutions. And so I decided to flip this question on its head and to understand how the built environment and the design impact on household practices and resulting energy consumptions. And to do this, I use Sperling and Partners' practice-based intervention framework, which suggests that a shift towards more sustainable and low energy consumption can be achieved either through recrafting practices, so changing the individual elements within existing practices, or by substituting practices themselves, or by changing how different practices integrate and are organized in our everyday routines. So this will become a bit clearer as I explain through my own case study. So for this, I selected 3 critical case study houses that represent stark differences in their built environments to see how this would then impact on household practices. So we start with a conventional contemporary house as the control case. Now, this is very similar to the house that we saw at the end of our timeline. So it is a contemporary bungalow-style detached house with an open-planned living room, large glass windows, and these narrow, non-functioning outdoor spaces, and almost complete reliance on mechanical means of ventilation and cooling. Now, I did a spatio-temporal mapping of the household practices based on the interviews as well as time-use diaries from the homeowners, just to see how the household practices were being performed in what spaces through a typical summer day. So if we look at the conventional house here, we find that there is sparing use of the outdoor spaces, while there's quite a lot of intermittent use of indoor spaces. Now, in this case, the homeowners explicitly mentioned that they were unable to use their living room during the peak period of the day, which is the late afternoon, because this was an open plan space. So even with the air conditioner on, they weren't able to make it comfortable. And so they ended up using their drawing room for a couple of hours during the afternoon. You can also see that there's quite a heavy reliance on mechanical ventilation and cooling throughout the day. Okay, coming to the second case study house. Now, this is a very interesting low energy eco house. It's a semi-detached house that was built by a local architect for himself. It's a climate responsive building that was designed for improved thermal comfort with maximum provision of green outdoor spaces. So there is roof insulation provided from the roof gardens, which cover 80% of the total plot area. There is also a louvered boundary wall that allows the air to circulate while filtering out solar radiations. Now, in this case, the only reason that the homeowners were able to construct such a high wall was because of the leniency of the building regulations in this particular housing scheme. So this louvered wall, together with the raised side passage, provide privacy in the roof gardens, which include a vegetable patch, a space for keeping pets, and poultry. There are also water fountains and different water features and lots of space for the kids to play. Now, although this house has also been designed on an open plan format, but in this case, it has been made permissible through a central cooling system. So the architect devised a very innovative low energy ground source cooling mechanism by using these ducts that pass underneath the entire house. And then evaporative coolers and dehumidifiers are then used to blow cool air into the different spaces in the house. And this is automated through time control. Another very interesting feature of the house is that the entire layout is based on incremental step gradations between the adjacent spaces, avoiding the typical splitting of floor spaces into distinct levels, which allows for a much more integrated and organic flow of the spaces. So a comparative analysis of the temperature and humidity data calculations in the 3 case studies shows that because of the better insulation provided in the eco house, together with the provision of a basement, the overall temperature and humidity values are much more stable, as you can see here in green. And also there were overall lower mean temperatures seen in the eco house as compared to the other 2 cases. Now, coming to the third critical case study house. Now, for this, we are actually going to head back to the same Haveli that we started off with at the beginning of our timeline. Now, before I explained how this Haveli was being used a century ago, but the same family, now in its 7th generation, occupies this Haveli. And so we look at its contemporary use today. So what we find is that the central courtyard is still being used by the family, but now it's being used more for special occasions, such as get-togethers and religious festivals. The kitchen and the washing machine is still located outside, which means that laundering and cooking are being performed outdoors. But what was most interesting for me was to see that although the house has been designed for passive comfort, but these localized split air conditioners have now been installed in most of the indoor spaces. And this is understandable because if we look at the indoor temperatures, especially in the first floor, we find that they can go up to 37 degrees Celsius in the summer. And there are a number of factors for this. The obvious one being climate change. So the outdoor temperatures have gradually been increasing over the last few decades. There is much more air pollution as well because of heavy road traffic and automobiles and vehicles. And there is extensive urban heat island effect. So this Haveli is located in a very dense, highly populated part of the city. And so some form of mechanical ventilation and cooling is required. But at the same time, we see that this is also because of changed socio-cultural norms for cooling and comfort. So it became apparent when talking to the homeowners that they were quite reflexive of their increased reliance on mechanical ventilation and cooling. So for example, the homeowner said that, I want to, if I'm coming out of an air-conditioned space, I want to go back into an air-conditioned space. And so this speaks to the increased levels and increased standards for thermal comfort over time. Now, having said this, there were some plus points as well. So the first floor of the Haveli, which you can see here, has been converted into a museum, and the homeowner, who is the curator of this museum, works from home. Now, please imagine this in the pre-COVID era when this actually meant something. Now, in a lot of the new housing communities, mixed-use buildings are not allowed in the residential areas, which means that you are not allowed to have a home office or work from home. Also, the Haveli is located in the walled city, which has an inclusive zoning format, which means that the residential, commercial, educational, and business districts are not separated. And what I found was that this actually has an effect on some of the household practices like cooking and laundry. So for example, this Haveli is actually located in the center of a marketplace. And whenever the homeowners need something, instead of stocking up on household goods and grocery, they actually just buy these goods on a needs basis. So right opposite the Haveli, there is actually a bakery, a chaiwala, which is a tea server, a tanur, which is a bread oven, even an ATM, a tailor, and a watchmaker. So this was the only house from all of the different houses that I interviewed in the various parts of Lahore that did not own a deep freezer in the house, which is something quite unusual for a middle-class family living in Lahore today. There were also some differences found in their laundry practices. So most of their laundry was being outsourced to a nearby communal laundry facility. Again, something which is not readily available in some of the new housing communities. So having looked at these three critical cases and their differing built environments, how do the practices compare? So if we use the practice intervention framework and take the conventional house as the control case, we find that interventions in comfort-related practices have successfully been accomplished in the eco-house, not just because of the changes in the material elements, but also because of the skills required in alternative technology implementation and use, as well as in the homeowners' changed meanings around health and well-being associated with comfort. So in this case, the homeowners were adamant that they did not want to rely on the localized air conditioners, which tend to isolate and confine spaces and recirculate air. So they wanted to have better air circulation with evaporative cooling. Now, both Eco House and the Haveli were able to substitute some of their indoor practices with more outdoor space use, which means less reliance on artificial lighting and mechanical cooling during the time spent outdoors. As well as we see that there was an overall better utilization of the spaces as well. And in terms of how practices are integrated and organized, we see that in the Haveli, because of its mixed use development, it allowed a home office of sorts. And also because of the inclusive zoning format, there were differences in the cooking, laundering, and mobility practices, which result in very different energy profiles and perhaps less energy intensity. Now, exploring practice-based interventions in design and use doesn't just end here. It's relatively easier to form connections between the architecture and the spatial configurations with household practices and energy consumption. But I would argue that it's equally important to take a step back and to look at the housing practices. That is, the practices involved in housing design, construction, and development, and to explore how these impact on household practices through the architecture as a mediator. So exploring some of these connections, in the case of Pakistan, we see that by substituting, recrafting, or changing how some of these housing practices interlock, there can be changes made in the energy consumption in household practices. For example, by substituting more stringent prescriptive building regulations with more flexible performance-based building bylaws, and by recrafting design practices, improved knowledge and skills of the practitioners, as well as the promotion of more efficient, sustainable, and locally procured material supply chains, and by introducing better means of communication between different stakeholders, this can potentially lead to less energy-intensive household practices, such as promoting greater outdoor space use, or ensuring privacy of these spaces, by introducing changed meanings of health and well-being related to comfort, and by allowing more collective practices. So taking such a holistic systems of practice approach helps to reveal how domestic energy demand is contingent on household, but also housing practices. And in this, the individual actors, such as architects as the designers or the homeowners as the end users, actually have limited agency for change within this wider network. And this idea sort of stands in contestation to behavior change models that put the responsibility of change on the consumers as the individual rational choice makers. So coming to the conclusions now. I hope that my study has been able to show that household energy consumption is embedded in both the material and the social structures that are mutually dependent, co-evolve, and hence require a joint analysis for us to really get to the crux of what energy demand management is all about. So the key point here is that focusing on just the technology or material efficiency will inevitably result in gaps where, for example, the estimated values don't match up to the actual values of consumption. Another point that I want to make is that my study has shown how domestic electricity consumption has continued to increase in the global south despite improvements in technological efficiencies and building fabrics. And so assigning technology complete agentive power is misleading. A blind following of the westernized modernistic spatial configurations and functional distributions have resulted in reproducing these practice arrangements that are not only culturally and climatically ill-suited, but are also inherently more energy intensive. Now, my study has been done for a very specific context, but certainly there are parallels that can be drawn for other areas. So studies in the UK, for instance, have shown that even though the efficiency of the building fabrics and heating systems has increased over time, but so has the demand for space heating. And finally, looking at some of the implications for policy and research. So I hope that I've been able to show that a socio-technical approach that takes this longitudinal analysis of practices and material arrangements can help us to move beyond just focusing on technology and materiality. And it can help us to reframe policy so that we begin to tackle some of the vital issues around how our space is being designed, perceived, and used. So I think it is imperative for us to start asking these critical questions around the need to build and the use of built. Secondly, house planning and development policies need to be developed in collaboration with energy policies, because otherwise they end up contradicting each other, as they have done in my case. So my case study shows that building regulations have continued to promote indoor space use while reproducing these non-functioning negative voids of outdoor spaces because of their very stringent and prescriptive nature. And so it's essential for us to, instead of compartmentalizing policies, to have better dialogue between energy and non-energy policies, such as those of housing, urban development, health, mobility, and transportation, to name a few. And finally, there is now a widespread agreement that a multidisciplinary approach is needed if we are to tackle some of the critical global challenges that we face today around climate change. And in this, I believe that the social sciences and humanities have an essential role to play, because it is these perspectives that can really help us to recognize and prevent the normalization of standards that gradually become embedded into our institutional and infrastructural frameworks. So I'd like to end my talk today with these very thought-provoking words by the social scientist Thomas Gairen, who said that the play of agency and structure happens as we build. We mold buildings, they mold us, we mold them anew. Thank you.
Okay, Rihab, thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. So the floor is open now for questions. And we already have a question from Asma Hassan. I don't know if Asma wants to ask the question themselves or if I shall just read it out. Just give you 2 seconds in case you want to. Yeah?
Hiya.
Hello.
Just a second.
Hi, Smar.
Okay, please go ahead, Asma. We may have lost Asma for a bit. I'll start by asking the question, but I think you mentioned something on your previous slide that links in with this. So if I understand the question right, Asma is saying, don't you think that the reason why Pakistan is behind in sustainability measures is because first world countries like the UK have implemented lots of laws and that entail a lot of the latest technology, etc. And such assessment may not necessarily show how the use of a Haveli might be better than a more modernly built home. And also there's a question about the possibility of implementing the techniques that are being prescribed or being suggested in first world countries for a country like Pakistan.
Right. Thank you, Asmar, for the question. I'd just like to say that my own research wasn't really focused on understanding the material dynamics so much. So I can't really, based on my own research, I can't really answer this question because my own focus was more on the spatial configuration of the houses. And the reason that it was so was because I found that there had been lots of research that had already been done on materials and their properties, their thermodynamics, and how different types of materials. I mean, within architecture, this is a very established domain, looking at the materials, the insulations, and all of these different, their thermal conductivities and the insulation values and how they can be improved in design. For me, the idea, as far as this idea of replicating some of these some of these principles and guidelines that are developed in the West into very specific contexts of the global South is itself problematic, because this is where we sort of lose the connection with not just the physical parameters such as the climate and the environment itself, but also the socio-cultural needs of the people, the norms. And so my own study was much more focused on how spaces had evolved and how those spatial configurations had changed, that had begun to sort of, under the processes of colonization, but also more broadly industrialization and westernization, sort of lost touch with what was actually needed and the sociocultural needs of the people. And while I am in agreement that the material aspects do definitely need to be considered, and there are lots of architects out there who are doing just that, but I think as architects, we need to bring in much more of the social science theories to understand just the need of what we are building and how they're going to be used, how occupants are going to interact with those buildings, and how they're going to age and grow with time. So from my perspective, I would say that my own focus and my own interest was just more on that aspect. Second thing that I want to say in terms of materiality, though, is that lots of, there was a movement in the 1980s towards regionalism and revivalism of some of the craftsmanship and use of local materials and local techniques in architecture, because by that point, the architects themselves had started to recognize that a blind imitation and following of some of these Western guidelines had been problematic. And so there's lots of work during the 80s onwards that does start to talk about revivalism and regionalism and bringing in craftsmanship. And so I would suggest that the best way to implement some of these techniques and technologies is to localize them and to adapt and appropriate them to the local culture, which some of the local architects like Kamil Khan Mumtaz and Yasmin Lari have been doing in an excellent way. So I would definitely recommend that you look at their work.
Okay, thank you, Rihab. There is also a question from Deborah Talmy, which I'll read out, and then once you've responded, Deborah can say if she has got all the answer that she wants. So this says, first of all, thanks for your enlightening presentation. Deborah's wondering whether there's any trend in Pakistan that goes against embracing the British model. For example, are young people interested in more privacy in bedrooms or in going back to sleeping in one room with the rest of the family? Is traditional considered backwards, for example? And how can this change so that people can take advantage of the good things in the past?
Thanks, Deborah. It's a very interesting question and something that I think I've continued to struggle with and try to understand in my own work. I mean, I think I should just put this warning out there that I presented a very linear timeline of how the house spaces and these configurations had evolved. Of course, in reality, that's just not how it works. So it's not such a linear process. At any one time during the different architectural periods in Lahore, there were lots of variations of those configurations, some adopting some of those colonial inspirations more so than others. So there are models that kind of are in between, that hybridized, and that bungalow, the British bungalow as well. As far as my own understanding based on the interviews that I did, it was so interesting how people would respond to some of the questions that I asked around, their needs and their aspirations for the kind of buildings that they want to build for themselves and they want to live in. So most people would recognize that there are problems in the way that we are designing buildings today, because they in their everyday lives, they have to deal with the kind of increased heat gains from these large windows, the functional difficulties that are inherent in some of the spatial layouts. But then when I asked them about, maybe perhaps going back to, the traditional models or the vernacular models, there is a hesitancy as well. So of course, from an architectural point of view, when you talk to architects, they do say that, their justification is that you can't go back to the past. And those houses were built because of the technology that was prevalent at the time. And of course, I mean, we don't necessarily need to have 3 feet thick walls anymore. So there is alternative technology that could be used that would provide the same benefits. So we have to move forwards. But then there are also these underlying socio-cultural aspirations. So the idea of the American dream is quite strong. And this international model and this international style of architecture is still quite dominant. So even though people, for example, don't necessarily use the windows that they install in their houses, but they're not willing to let go of those windows because it brings with it this social status, of modernity. So there is definitely, I would say, this idea of backwardness that is attached with traditional techniques as well as traditional styles. But of course, it's not just a one-way street. There are lots of architects, as I mentioned, from the 80s onwards, there was this movement for revivalism, and there are architects who are really doing a lot and making a lot of effort to bring that craftsmanship back into architectural practices. But it's a very complicated picture. It has a lot to do with not just globalization itself, because people get inspired by things that they see on their tours internationally, but also because of what is easier done at a mainstream level of architecture. So, for example, the house that I showed you in the center for the critical case study house is the low energy house. It's very difficult for a layman to be able to construct that kind of house for themselves because the kind of skills and knowledge and craftsmanship that is required is not mainstream. So for the majority of people, they would either just buy a ready-made house or hire a contractor to build that house for them. And so the easiest thing would be to just replicate what is being mass produced. So it's a very complicated picture with lots of different negotiations at play.
Deborah, would you like to react, or are you happy with the answer?
Very happy. Thank you very much. Really interesting.
You're most welcome.
Okay, we've got a next question from Atriji, and she asks if you can elaborate on the impact of the extreme weather, so hot summers and cold winters in Lahore, on the spatial design of houses.
Yeah, so I mean, if you, one of the things that did strongly come across during this, when I was looking at some of these older houses in some of the older parts of Lahore was how well they did respond to the climate. And because they were designed to respond to the climate, there was no other option really at the time. You couldn't just install technology had not evolved to the extent that you could rely on something like mechanical ventilation and cooling. And so you had to make the most with the materials and with the design of the houses. And so in these old Havelis, some of the features that you can see across the board are that the walls used to be like really thick. So you would get from anywhere between like 1 feet to 3 feet thick walls. The ceiling height would be quite high with these vents just near the ceiling that would allow this stack ventilation to take place, so that warmer air would then be evacuated and cooler air would come back into the space. Windows itself used to be quite small, so these vents were all that were present available in terms of windows. This was not only conducive to privacy, but also to prevent heat gains, which is something that does happen very much with the single glazed large windows that we have today. So because the climate of Lahore is predominantly, so it's a semi-arid climate where for approximately 7 months of the year, it's extremely hot with a few months of mild winters. So the design should ideally respond to the hot climate, particularly the hot summer period. And that certainly means that, it should be shaded. It should have more, enclosed spaces. Heat gains should be avoided. Better insulation should be provided on the roof, especially. So in the old houses, they used to have like a 1 feet thick layer of mud on the roof. But the alternative of that is certainly roof gardens, which is an excellent way to ensure that there is greenery, there is that evaporative cooling as well as transpiration, and it's just it helps the environment as well. I mean, one of the things that unfortunately has happened in Lahore in the last 5 to 10 years is that there's so much smog these days in the winters, and this is because there has just been this rampant construction and infrastructure development without paying any heed to green spaces. And we are facing the consequences of this now. So certainly, I mean, in any region, climate should be the top priority for design, and climate responsive design is certainly key. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I don't know if there are any further questions. It doesn't look like it at the moment. So maybe I'll do exactly what Atriji is proposing here and say a big thank you to you, Rihab, again, for staying up until almost midnight to give us a really interesting and thought-provoking talk. And so I hope that you will soon go and find a bit of rest. And I would like to invite everyone to give some kind of token to say thank you for your wonderful and interesting talk. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Henriette. It has been a pleasure. And I certainly hope I'll be able to do this in person sometime at Lucy. It's been a weird start to my fellowship.
Yeah, I think we're all hoping that very, very soon we'll be able to do this in real time and face to face. So thanks very much, Rihab. And thank you all for listening. Bye-bye.
Yes, well done.